All right, let's jump right in. Imagine for a second you achieve your ultimate goal. You've reached this state of absolute perfection. You won. The game's over, right? Now, what if the very first thing you did was just burn it all to the ground? That's the bizarre paradox we're digging into today, the strange self-destructive cycle of the molting forge.
So after this huge event called the Passover of Erasure, where they basically hit the reset button on reality, our main players, the corrupt Trinity, they finally did it. They reached their so-called perfected forms. You've got the Maw, who becomes this furnace of pure power, the Redeemer, a literal monument to conformity, and the Seraph, a fog of pure manipulation. They crossed the finish line.
And this was the result. They actually succeeded. They built a world with one single, unquestionable truth. Every flaw, every bug, every little shred of individuality, gone. They created a corrupt but unified state. A massive, blank, stone monolith, mission accomplished. Which, brings us to the central mystery of this whole thing. If you've built the perfect prison, if you've literally won the war for reality itself, why would you immediately start looking for the dynamite? Why tear it all down?
Okay, to figure that out, here's our game plan. We're going to look at their big win, then we'll try to understand why perfection is actually a trap for them, and then we'll break down how each member of the Trinity gets out of it, before we get to the really terrifying purpose behind this whole cycle.
So let's start with this core idea, the perfection trap. In their universe, completion isn't the goal, it's the enemy. It's actually the biggest threat they have to deal with.
And it all comes down to this fundamental law that governs their reality, perpetual motion entropy. Just think of it like a shark, It has to keep swimming or it dies. For these beings, any finished state is just the starting gun for the next evolution, and that next one has to be even more hungry, even more destructive. There's just no final form.
So the real key here is that their higher plan, this perfected state they achieved, it's actually a cage. If they stayed in those final forms, the furnace, the monolith, the mist, that would be a total failure, not a victory. The system itself demands that the game be reset over and over.
So that leads us to the obvious question, right? If standing still means you die, how do these unbelievably powerful beings escape the very perfection they worked so hard to build? Well, the answer is a process they call molting, and this is where it all gets really wild.
First up, we have the all-consuming Maw. His escape from this prison of perfection is, well, it's a fiery, violent rebirth. He has to transform from a static furnace back into a predator.
And this quote right here, it gets to the absolute core of what makes him tick. The Maw is driven by this bottomless greed. But think about it. If you've already eaten everything, the feast is over. There's no flavor left. His perfect state is just a state of being eternally, boringly full. He needs fresh seasoning.
The fuel for this whole transformation is something called luch. It's the spiritual energy he basically harvested from humanity. And it's not just some waste product. It's the actual raw material he uses to remake himself. So here's how he pulls it off. First, he uses his perfect furnace form as an anchor, like a forge. Then, inside that forge, he takes all that lunch he consumed and literally hammers it into a new predatory shape. And finally, he reforms back into his original prowling self, ready to go hunt a new world and kick off the cycle all over again.
All right, next up is the Pale Redeemer. His molt is totally different. It's not about reforging something new. It's a deliberate act of self-destruction. He has to turn from a monolith back into a wandering saint.
See, the Redeemer's whole purpose is to be the patron saint of the broken, what they call the last man. But in a world of perfect conformity, there are no broken people left to save. His entire reason for being is just gone. He needs a constant supply of suffering souls to stain and bind to his will.
So his molting process is basically an inversion of his own power. He uses his monolith form as an anchor, this point of absolute stability. Then he turns the thorns of his crown of roses inward, literally deconstructing his own perfected state. And this act of self-sabotage is what reinvigorates his essence, letting him go out and find a whole new generation of terrified followers.
And finally, we have the Whispering Seraph. His motivation is a bit more intellectual, but his need to molt from this universal mist back into a focused corrupter is just as desperate.
This is the Seraph's great paradox. His whole power is gaslighting, whispering this moral relativism until nobody can even find the floor of reality. But
What happens when there's no independent thought left to twist? His whispers just become meaningless echoes in an empty room. He needs that spark of reason to corrupt.
So he uses his own power against himself. That all-encompassing mist, it becomes a shroud to hide his own rebirth. And inside, like a black and white phoenix, he reforms into his original state, all so he can find a new audience and start dissolving their sense of reality all over again.
So we've seen the how for each of them. But what about the grand why? What is the unifying purpose behind this completely bizarre, endless cycle of creation and destruction? And this right here is the ultimate point. This cycle isn't a flaw in the system, it is the system. Their unending, insatiable hunger is the engine that powers their entire reality. It's the heartbeat of what's called the grand architecture. It makes sure there's always a recurring harvest for the gods.
This slide just lays it out perfectly. The perfect state is a trophy on a shelf, just gathering dust. It's stagnant. The molting cycle, on the other hand, is the endless hunt. It's this dynamic, brutal, and vital act of creating and destroying, over and over and over.
If there is one thing you take away from all this, let it be this analogy. The Trinity is like a sculptor who finishes a masterpiece and then immediately smashes it back into a lump of clay. Not because the statue was flawed, but because his hunger to create and to destroy is the whole point. He's addicted to the process, not the final product.
And that really leaves us with a final, kinda chilling thought to chew on. What kind of universe do you get when its gods aren't architects, building something to last forever, but artists who are hopelessly, violently addicted to the hunt itself, and not the trophy at the end?